Thank you for inviting me here. I should say that following Maria Julia's request, I translated my PowerPoint into French. Actually, I did not translate it. AI translated it, so any errors, my own. But I will read when I read a slide, I will read it in English, and my talk will be in English. So it will be bilingual kind of affair.
You don't have open your camera?
Well, they're all been talking to her.
Yes, I know.
Oh, wow.
No, okay.
I mean, I'm pretty, but I'm not that pretty. No, it's a must. All right. So in 2023, I published an ethnography of the development and use of art-producing artificial intelligence technologies in the fields of poetry and jazz. And it was called The Inspiration Machine, Computational Creativity in Poetry and Jazz. And I dedicated the book to my parents. My dedication was simple, to Henya and Gilead. These are the names of my parents. When I proudly presented the book to my mother, her first reaction was to reproach me and to be angry. She asked, "Why did you not write to my parents, Henya and Gilead?" She was actually upset about this dedication. And she continued to voice her disapproval in the following days to anyone who cared to listen, and there were not many people who cared to listen. But it didn't bother her, she still complained. This, of course, bothered me. I later vented my frustration to my older brother, who reminded me that as kids, whenever we would proudly announce to our grandmother, my mother's mother, that we scored 99 out of 100 in a school exam, she would first ask, "Why did you not score 100? And then, did someone else in class score 100? So in other words, scolding instead of praising us for our achievements was a proud family tradition. Still, I could not wrap my head around the fact that my mother's reaction was to take offense and that she could not be swayed into seeing the matter differently. When my brother, who has worked in high tech for decades, saw my perplexity, he thought that ChatGPT would be better able to explain to me the situation. So his prompt to the chatbot was the following. This is what he asked the bot. "My brother wrote a book and dedicated it to his parents by name without mentioning how they are related to him. They were offended. Can you explain why?" And the bot's response was the following. One, misinterpretation of intent. Your parents might have misinterpreted his intention. They could perceive the lack of specifying their relationship as an attempt to distance himself or downplay their role in his life. Second, cultural or personal values. In some cultures or family dynamics, explicitly stating family relationships and roles is important. Not doing so might be seen as disregarding family bonds or traditions. And the third explanation that the bot provided was previous dynamics. If there have been misunderstandings or sensitivities in the family dynamics previously, this incident might be perceived in that context, regardless of your brother's actual intent. So, in as much as conversational bots such as ChatGPT are going to be used more frequently by more people and in an increasing number of daily situations, they point to new problem areas and fields of investigation for linguistic and semiotic anthropologists. And some of those problems and fields can effectively be conceptualized based on Michael Silverstein's ideas about, quote, the intersecting dimensions of a semiotic space in which culture is to be found, namely signification, circulation, and emanation. And I will explain each of these dimensions later. A point I would like to illustrate by means of this vignette around the book, the dedication, and my subsequent interactions with ChatGPT about it. Focusing on each of these dimensions, but giving more space to emanation, my main argument is twofold. That's the argument. One, in the case of ChatGPT, there is an ambiguity within each of these dimensions, signification, circulation, and emanation, And some of these ambiguities are at the core of the fascination generated by ChatGPT and of the fact that this technology is fast becoming a key player in the semiotic space in which culture is to be found today. So let me start with signification. One of Silverstein's enduring contributions was to elucidate the nature of sociocultural context. Such a context becomes salient for interactants in situated communicational events through acts of signification. And Silverstein frequently used relative deference entitlement as an example to illustrate this point. And it's an example that is serendipitously related to my opening vignette, because it became clear to me that in my mother's eyes, I failed miserably to show such deference to her. So Silverstein has argued that, and I will read it, as I said, the quote in English, but here it's in French. We can infer that this aspect of the context of communication, that is relative deference entitlement, has become salient for interacting individuals precisely through the way certain signals seem to point knowledgeable interlocutors unerringly to it and make its contextual existence consequential for any subsequent interaction. Knowledgeable interlocutors, they know the indexical system, however implicitly, and they understand a verbal or other indexical or pragmatic paradigm to structure usage such that the event of one individual using one but not another indexical sign in a paradigm of contrast constitutes an act of recognition of this interlocutory other's relative entitlement to deference in the social world they share, or at least have come to share, in and by discursive interaction. Against this backdrop, one problem area for linguistic anthropologists will be to determine the extent to which conversational bots such as ChatGPT can function as a kind of knowledgeable interlocutor, that is, one who knows the indexical system. And here I suggest there is a key ambiguity that is also one reason this bot generates intense fascination. And it's also like a way in which this empirical reality complicates this analytical machinery that Silverstein developed. On the one hand, one can detect in the bot's response hints to the indexical system that might have provided the backdrop to my mother's reaction. If we return again to the three explanations that the bot gave me, you can see that the bot's first and second explanations resemble what Silverstein called descriptions of indexical creativity. That is, they bring up the possibility that I deliberately attempted to distance myself from my parents by mentioning them by name only. The third explanation resembles a description of what Silverstein called indexical presupposition. That is, it brings up the possibility that my dedication pointed to or invoked already existing problematic family dynamics, such as previous family feuds and quarrels. In other words, the bot seems to be able to give a detailed description of the indexical or pragmatic paradigm that very likely accounts for the fact that my usage of one but not another indexical sign in a paradigm of contrast constituted for my mother the absence of an act of recognition on my part of her relative entitlement to deference in the social world that we share. On the other hand, even if we agree that ChatGPT seems to be able to generate some descriptive knowledge of some aspect of the indexical system that might be relevant to the vignette with which I opened this talk, this does not mean that it can seamlessly participate in a real-time interaction with humans while appearing to mobilize this knowledge convincingly and consistently. And one reason for this is related to another of Silverstein's enduring contributions, namely the argument that, quote, for the participants within a sociocultural order, their essentially conventional indexicality in communication works to generate a structured, dimensionalized contextual surround only to the degree that there is a regimenting metaprogrammatic function that renders signs actual indexes for their users within some sociocultural order that interacting individuals can presume upon, and in and by using particular indexes, invoke as the basis for the interpretability of their signaling, unquote. Such regimenting metaprogrammatic function is, of course, the basis for the emergent plot of the interaction. Now, anyone who has tried to engage in a prolonged interaction with one of the contemporary conversational bots has probably noticed that at some point in the unfolding interaction, the bot might appear to be losing the plot, often suddenly so, and perhaps for a very short time. Witnessing it is like experiencing short interferences in a TV image. One reason for this is that such bots operate not based on the different indexically calibrated and token versus type focused kinds of metaprogrammatic phenomena that perform such a crucial role in humans' ability to participate effectively in a real-time discursive interaction, understood as an emergent text in context. Rather, what these bots do, impressively so, is based on the analysis of an immense trove of previously existing textual data in relation to the prompts they are given and on the textual patterns and probabilities that this analysis yields. To illustrate this point, consider Silverstein's analogy for what using language, socioculturally speaking, is. And here's another quote. I like to say that using language is like a pantomime, that figurative, iconic art where completely without denotation of words and expressions, a mime uses bodily movements in space over time that must be read as an enacted indexical text pointing to its indexical complement, stimulating the viewer in this mode to create an interpretable context for the bodily kinesis, and thus to understand it as an interpretable, coherent story, an interactional text in context of what is going on here and now over some interval of performance, unquote. Now, this beautiful analogy not only distills the fact that language in use is not merely about denotational language, it also clarifies how far generative AI technologies are, at least for now, from being able to effectively participate in ongoing signifying acts with humans, if only because they lack the meaningful embodied basis that provides so many of the resources that human interactants use to metaprogrammatically calibrate the signs that they send and receive. Although, as Silverstein has cautioned, quote, the pantomime analogy should not lead us to conclude that things are easier with spoken or graphic language, unquote. Thus, regardless of how detailed or accurate the denotational definition or description of pantomime, and by extension of an indexical system, a technology such as ChatGPT might be able to generate, performing pantomime, or by extension, mobilizing this indexical system effectively and consistently in an ongoing real-time communicational event with humans is different and much more complex. And technological bots are not good at that. As far as the technology such as ChatGPT is concerned, then there is an ambiguity or a gap at the heart of the dimension of signification. That this technology seems to be able to instantly generate a thorough description of the indexical system or paradigm that is very likely appropriate to a specific past communicational event between humans, like the incident between me and my mother, but it cannot mobilize this system effectively in a communicational event with humans over time. However, I suggest that this ambiguity or gap not only points to the uniqueness of ChatGPT as a conversational agent, it is also one of the sources of the fascination it generates. If the instant generation of a description of an indexical system or paradigm is an immediately visible and impressive evidence of the bot's human-like capabilities, the bot's inability to effectively mobilize such a system in a real-time and prolonged interactional events with humans can only be revealed with time, during one's interaction with it, and often subtly so. Yet it is precisely this ability that is much more consequential for any bot to be considered truly conversational. I now move to the second dimension, which is the circulation. So circulation, according to Silverstein, has to do with, quote, the apparent movement or transfer of signification across events of discursive or equivalent interaction in social process. Movement or transfer that takes place through mechanisms of interdiscursivity, communicative events creatively referencing other communicative events. More specifically, circulation of type-level semiotic material is an inferred effect or consequence of token-level interdiscursive links across interactional sites, whether such links are those of true intertextuality, replication by degrees, or of representation, report, or of indexical renvoi or prolepsis, unquote. Against this backdrop, one problem area for linguistic anthropologists would be to determine whether and what kinds of mechanisms of interdiscursivity underlie the functionality of a technology such as ChatGPT. I suggest that here too there is a key ambiguity in the kind of interdiscursivity that is at stake. And here too, this ambiguity both points to the uniqueness of ChatGPT as a conversational agent, and it accounts for some of this technology's ability to dazzle its users. And I will explain, I will demonstrate it through my subsequent interaction with the bot. So after I prompted ChatGPT with my brother's query and read its reply, which was somewhat similar to the reply that my brother received, I asked the bot a few questions about the use of chats for training purposes. For example, when I asked it whether ChatGPT trains on the conversations people have with it, the bot responded with the following. As of now, ChatGPT does not learn or train on individual conversations in real time. Your specific interactions with me are not used to directly update or train the model. OpenAI, the organization behind ChatGPT, may collect and store data from user interactions for the purpose of improving the model over time, but this is done in a controlled and anonymized manner. These data are typically aggregated and used in a way that ensures privacy and confidentiality. It's important to note that any improvements made to the model come from large-scale, curated data sets used in training and are not based on individual user conversations, unquote. When I asked the bot to clarify how does OpenAI collect and store data from user interactions for the purpose of improving the model over time, the bot pointed out again that, quote, OpenAI may collect the conversations users have with ChatGPT or other models for analysis. This data can include the content of the messages exchanged as well as system responses, and that data is usually aggregated and anonymized, meaning individual conversations are not traced back to specific users. This helps ensures that any patterns or issues are studied at a broad level rather than focusing on any single individual. And elsewhere in its response, the bot emphasized that, quote, ChatGPT does not have memory between conversations. This means that once a session ends, I cannot remember any prior interactions. Okay, unquote. Now, on the one hand, in as much as OpenAI gathers the data produced whenever users interact with ChatGPT, provided such users have not opted out of allowing their conversations to be used for training, and in as much as it uses this data to train this technology and to inform its subsequent interactions with users, then we certainly have something that resembles patterns of interdiscursivity across the semiotic nodes that are the discursive interactions between users and ChatGPT. On the other hand, the fact that the data thus collected is always aggregated, that is, broken down to raw data that is then processed en masse by means of statistical techniques to identify general patterns, trends, or features in user interactions rather than individual conversations, as the bot further explained, means that at stake is not necessarily something that resembles the mechanisms of interdiscursivity that Silverstein highlighted. Indeed, consider the fact that in discussing circulation, Silverstein has argued the following. The central sociological characteristic of circulation is that it is lumpy and unstable precisely because the interactional events mediated by what we can term transmission of textual and textualized semiosis are nodes in chains of connectivity regimented by social structures of many different kinds. We never communicate with others purely as disembodied and asocial cognitions. Our relative positionalities as social selves are essentially involved, as are our group interests, as are our individual and group projects. Everyone in a social formation does not communicate directly with everyone else about everything that is on his or her mind, notwithstanding fantasies about happy, rational communicators in otherwise mass public spheres, unquote. Now, the fact that the interdiscursive links across interactional sites, in the case of ChatGPT and similar technologies, are based on the aggregation of big data is, of course, at the core of its ability to instantly generate responses that seem to align with users' expectations about what an interaction with a human being should look like. However, it is also at the core of the kind of feeling of abstraction or standardization that one has when interacting with the system over a prolonged period of time, a feeling that is not unlike that of interacting precisely with a disembodied and asocial cognition. So ChatGPT is precisely that kind of cognition that Silverstein says that does not exist. And a disembodied and asocial cognition that is at the same time communicating directly with almost everyone else about almost everything, right? So we have here the kind of cognition that in this quote, it says that basically we do not have. A qualification to this observation is this: not everyone has access to or the desire to interact with ChatGPT, and OpenAI has imposed a number of restrictions about what ChatGPT can communicate about, restrictions that reflect OpenAI's own group interests. Equally important is the fact that if, in the domain of signification, ChatGPT can generate a description of explicit metapragmatics, for example, a description of an indexical system in the context of which using a name for a parent without stating one's relationship to the parent might constitute an offense, like in the case of my mother, but it cannot enact in real-time interactional events the pragmatic patterns entailed by this system. In the domain of circulation, the opposite ambiguity takes place. ChatGPT is designed to not be able to effectively employ metapragmatic framing of intertexts, that is, not recalling prior interactions, although its pragmatics are constantly informed by the statistically processed big or raw data that constitute the technology's massive intertextual foundations. And I'll now move to the third dimension, which is that of emanation. So there is no doubt that ChatGPT has become one of the most critical and prestigious sites of emanation, that is, a center of value production, which coincidentally, Silverstein at one point defines as, quote, generative centers of semiosis, unquote. And it's a very apt description of generative AI in the contemporary moment. It is precisely for this reason that critics are concerned about the kind of values and biases ChatGPT and similar technologies produce and reproduce. And if ChatGPT has become a critical generative center of semiosis and of value production, it is in large part, so I argue, because the agency that it epitomizes not only harkens back to, but also powerfully combines two archetypical and ideologically speaking antithetical kinds of generative agency that have been crucial for the modern Western identity. One is the expressive kind of agency, owing to romantic aesthetic theories, and the second one is the scientific kind of agency. So, in order to explain what kind of agencies we are talking about here, I go to Immanuel Kant, one of modernity's key ideological architects, and one whose own prestigious status made him, or rather his writings, a center of value production and a source of emanation. And at one point, he gave a seminal formulation of the nature of each kind of generative agency and of the relationship between them, and he did that in the Critique of the Power of Judgment. And this is the French translation of the English translation of the original journal. Thus, everything that Newton expounded in his immortal work on the principles of natural philosophy, no matter how great a mind it took to discover it, can still be learned. But one cannot learn to write inspired poetry, however exhaustive all the rules for the art of poetry, and however excellent the models for it may be. The reason is that Newton could make all the steps that he had to take, from the first elements of geometry to his great and profound discoveries, entirely intuitive not only to himself, but also to everyone else, and thus set them out for posterity quite determinately. but no Homer or Wieland can indicate how his ideas arise and come together in his head, because he himself does not know it and thus cannot teach it to anyone else either. In the scientific sphere, therefore, the greatest discoverer differs only in degree from the most hard-working imitator and apprentice, whereas he differs in kind from someone who is gifted by nature for beautiful art, unquote. So Kant's notion of the kind of generative agency that is responsible for inspired poetry and for inspired art in general was the combination of romantic ideologies of poetic inspiration, which emerged in the mid-18th century. Pre-romantic theories of poetic inspiration, going back to ancient Greece, stipulated that a great artwork is the creation of a mysteriously divine or supernatural external agency, such as the muses or the gods, for which the artist functions merely as a vessel. Romantic theories reproduce the notion of an independent and inscrutable creative agency, but they identified this agency with the artist's inner nature, which expresses itself spontaneously and over which the artist has no control. In this romantic cultural model, an inspired poem or painting is sudden, effortless, and complete, not because it is a gift from without, that is from the gods, but because it grows of itself within a region of the mind which is inaccessible either to awareness or control. Now, Kant's theories were an important center of value production from which these ideas emanated, but notable artists who tried to account for their creative process at roughly the same time were another such center. For example, William Blake wrote the following words in 1803 in relation to his epic poem, Milton. So this is what he wrote about how he created this epic poem. I have written this poem from immediate dictation. He basically says that it came to him like the poem, and he just spoke it out. I've written this poem from immediate dictation, 12 or sometimes 20 or 30 lines at a time, without premeditation and even against my will. He didn't want to create this poem, it just came out, yes? The time it has taken in writing was thus rendered non-existent, and an immense poem exists, which seems to be the labor of a long life, or produced without labor or study. Unquote. Blake's words epitomize the romantic ideology of creativity as the spontaneous and unmediated expression of an artist's highly unique and autonomous nature in the form of art that is complete and in no need of editing or improvement. And soon I will explain how all this is related to ChatGPT. Now, fast forward 200 years, and we find these ideas about the nature of each generative agency, the romantic, expressive, and the scientific, and the antithetical relationship between them, reproduced in and emanating from a key center of value production in our own contemporary culture, namely the movie industry. Okay, so the movie industry, especially mainstream cinema, is also a center of emanation of different values. And my example is the Hollywood movie Pollock from 2000, which focuses on the abstract expressionist painter Jackson Pollock. Throughout the movie, Pollock's art is depicted through the prism of romantic notions. That is, as the result of the possessed and unmediated creative expression of the artist's highly unique and autonomous inner nature over which Pollock has no control, and that eludes any analytical description or attempt to rationalize it. And of course, Pollock's specific art was conducive to this kind of alignment with the romantic theory because of the drip paint, etc. Importantly, Pollock's embodiment of the ideal of immediate and hence genuine, ideologically speaking, creative expression is buttressed by depictions of the painter Lee Krasner, Pollock's wife, as his brainy, analytical, and hence less creative antithesis. In an early scene, Pollock observes Krasner painting with painstaking care, carefully tracing a line. He then goes to his own room and starts painting with quick gestures that strongly contrast with Krasner's mode of painting. She then approaches him, looks at the painting he's working on, and she asks, quote, "What's this? I see the head, I see the body. This isn't cubism, Jackson, because you are not really breaking the figure into multiple views. You are just showing us one side. And what is this? Free association, automatism?" So we see her trying to rationalize it in a kind of like scientific manner. To this, Pollock responds, "I'm just painting, Lee." So he cannot actually he cannot and he does not want to theorize his own creativity. Krasner, however, continues her efforts to theorize Pollock's creativity while he continues to paint. And she says, she basically keeps pestering him, quote, "But what do you do, Jackson? Don't tell me that you don't know what you are doing. Are you experimenting with surrealism? Is this a dream? Even if it's a dream, it's still what you see. It's life. You're not just randomly putting paint on the canvas. You're painting something. You can't abstract from nothing. You can only abstract from life, from nature." And to this, Jackson responds, "I am nature," which is basically like the quintessential romantic definition of creativity. Indeed, Krasner's role throughout the movie is limited to taking care of Pollock's basic needs and to affirming his greatness. So there's obviously also like a very gendered kind of like division of labor. The movie does suggest that what appears to be randomly putting paint on the canvas is the result of the immediate expression of Pollock's inner nature, which defies theoretical exegesis and agentic control and intentionality, and that therein lies Pollock's greatness and the greatness of his paintings. And now back to ChatGPT. ChatGPT has become a center of emanation and of value production, in part because it powerfully combines these two kinds of agency that are fundamental to the modern Western identity. Consider the bot's following long response to my, to be sure somewhat nonsensical, follow-up query, a response that I quote in full for a reason that I will discuss subsequently. So I asked it, and here I did not translate it into French because it doesn't really matter, as you will soon see. I asked it, "Can you show me the code that animated your conclusions, like your earlier conclusions when I asked you about the dedication of the book?" And then ChatGPT responds, "The process of forming conclusions is not something that I perform through a simple script or animation that you could easily visualize as code. Rather, it's based on complex machine learning models, neural networks, and natural language processing techniques. However, I can explain the general workflow in terms of how it works behind the scenes. Here's an outline of how I arrived at my conclusions. If I were to translate it into a simplified form of pseudocode that reflects the process, and then it gives me more and more explanations. It explains, it starts with input parsing. First, the question you ask would be parsing the meaningful components. Then there is contextual analysis. The system analyzes the context of the question. Then there is pattern recognition. Then there is reasoning based on known concepts. The system applies learned models, et cetera, et cetera. Then generating a response. Then dynamic adjustment based on follow-up. And then final output. And then it offered a more detailed explanation. It says, in a real-world implementation, such as my own language model, these processes are supported by advanced deep learning algorithms like transformer networks, and it continues to explain. And then there's another explanation. Specifically, the steps would involve tokenization, attention mechanisms, neural networks, reinforcement learning. And then it offers to do like a visual presentation. If we were to visualize the process of generating conclusions or reasoning, it would look like this: input processing, context analysis, pattern recognition, reasoning and output, feedback loop. And then it concludes with the following. In essence, the code behind this is part of a highly complex system built from numerous interconnected layers of machine learning rather than something you could easily animate with a few lines of code. The process is built from the ground up to simulate human-like understanding and reasoning. Okay, so that was like the end of the very long response. Now, ChatGPT's elaborate response demonstrates the following. On the one hand, if asked, it can provide the user with different analytical explanations of the computational processes that are responsible for the output that it generated in response to any specific query. Indeed, its attempt to simplify for me those processes by means of Python and then by means of different versions of the same explanation seems to reflect the kind of generative agency that Kant attributed to Newton, who, to reiterate Kant's argument, quote, could make all the steps that he had to take from the first element of geometry to his great and profound discoveries entirely intuitive, not only to himself, but also to anyone else, and thus set them out for posterity quite determinately. Okay, so we have on the surface like an agency that can explain very well how it arrived to, how it generated a certain output. On the other hand, this explanation that ChatGPT provided is replete with qualifications that warn the user that this explanation does not align with the computational reality under the hood, which is much more complex. In reality, ChatGPT can generate seemingly complete textual constructions instantaneously, owing to a process whose specific details remain opaque even to this technology's developers who only understand the general contours or principles of this process. And this is a technical explanation. There it is, a technical explanation of the kind of architecture that underlines technologies such as ChatGPT and why it's so opaque. Many of the most advanced AI technologies, including generative AI tools, are what one might call organic black boxes. The creators of these tools do not intentionally obscure their operations. Rather, the deep learning systems that power these models are so complex that even the creators themselves do not understand exactly what happens inside them. Deep learning algorithms are a type of machine learning algorithms that use multi-layered neural networks. When a traditional machine learning model, a traditional machine learning model might use a network with 1 or 2 layers, deep learning models can have hundreds or even thousands of layers. Each layer contains multiple neurons, which are bundles of code designed to mimic the functions of the human brain. These deep neural networks are inherently opaque. Users, including AI developers, can see what happens at the input and output layers, what one calls the visible layers. They can see the data that goes in and the predictions, classifications, or other content that comes out. But they do not know what happens at all the network layers in between, the so-called hidden layers, unquote. Now, in this sense, ChatGPT's generative agency also aligns with the kind of agency Kant attributed to Homer and that Pollock epitomized in the aforementioned movie. At best, ChatGPT can provide a general outline of, to use Kant's words, how its ideas arise and come together in its head. But it cannot provide a detailed description of, quote, the specific steps that it had to take to reach its conclusions, such that anyone else could reach the same conclusions by following each of these specific steps. So here, too, we have a very specific ambiguity at the center of this axis of emanation. ChatGPT functions as a kind of inscrutable creative oracle, but a very chatty, inscrutable oracle that can give an endless number of different explanations about its own inner workings. It also functions as a kind of scientific mind, but a very opaque scientific mind that can only give a very general account of its reasoning. ChatGPT has become a center of emanation of cultural value in large part because in it are intersected these two kinds of agency that prototypically emanate from distinct and prestigious sites of value production, roughly the arts and the sciences. It thus upsets a division of scientific labor and institutionally anchored value production with roots in the early modern period. And I should say that this division of labor has been the center of my research for many years, and I can elaborate about it later. The intersection of these two prestigious sources of value production is likely to help ChatGPT to propagate myriad cultural values in the form of the output it produces, which users will accept as scientific and authoritative, while seeing the opaqueness of its generative process as evidence of, or as a precondition for its creativity, a feature rather than a bug. The result might be the absence of any desire to submit this and similar technologies to a critical analysis of their roots and fruits. There's another issue. Note that whereas most sites of emanation up to now analyzed by anthropologists corresponded to territorialized institutional centers, for example, schools, the church, the White House, the radically distributed nature of ChatGPT, that is, its reliance on numerous networked data centers located around the world, and more importantly, the fact that its communicative manifestations take place in the semiotic nodes that are the discursive interactions between users and ChatGPT around the world, means that as a site of emanation, it cannot be easily reduced to OpenAI's geographic location in Silicon Valley. This ambiguity, too, contributes to ChatGPT's power as a generative center of semiosis. For this technology both retains its association with Silicon Valley as a prestigious geographical locus of technological prowess, and appears to have an independent and ubiquitous emanating agency wherever and whenever users interact with it around the world. So to conclude, ChatGPT and similar generative AI technologies point to new problem areas and fields of investigation for linguistic and semiotic anthropologists. On the one hand, they function as participants in real-time interactional or signifying events, as infrastructures of circulation of signification across events of discursive interaction, and as sites of emanation of cultural value. On the other hand, they do not align with our expectations, our theoretical and analytical expectations from such participants, infrastructures, and sites. They can generate a description of explicit metapragmatics, that is, for example, a description of an indexical system that underlies the use of honorifics, but they cannot convincingly enact in real-time interactional events the pragmatic patterns entailed by such a system. They are designed to not effectively employ metapragmatic framing of intertexts, for example, not recalling prior interactions, although their pragmatics are constantly informed by the statistically processed big or raw data that constitute these technologies' massive intertextual foundations. Lastly, they combine two prestigious forms of agency without fully embodying any of these agencies, and their radically distributed nature makes them a site of emanation that both can and cannot be easily associated with a specific geographical location. These ambiguities are some of these technologies' distinguishing features that also account for the growing role such technologies play in the semiotic space in which culture is to be found today. As for my brief adventure with ChatGPT, it resulted in the realization that book dedications might be a very bad idea, unless their focus is inanimate entities, such as scenic roads in California's Santa Cruz Mountains, and I dedicated my second book to those roads. While most such inanimate entities will not be able to express their gratitude for dedication, they have this advantage that they will not be able to express their discontent with it either. Thank you.
Merci, Eitan. J'étais très curieux par cette idée, une sorte d'absence de mémoire de ChatGPT. En fait, une absence de mémoire très particulière, parce qu'il se souvient de nos échanges précédents. On pourrait même imaginer une sorte de mémoire immense qu'il pourrait retenir un certain temps. Et, alors le problème, ce n'est pas tellement la mémoire de ces échanges, nos échanges avec elle, peut-être justement là sur la dimension plus, je ne sais pas comment le dire, une sorte de, comme s'il avait uniquement la possibilité d'une mémoire textuelle, s'il ne pouvait pas avoir une autre mémoire. Voilà, justement, la mémoire d'interaction. Il a dit, je crois, somatique, spatiale, sensible. Donc, elle pourra avoir une mémoire absolue, justement, de nos échanges. Mais est-ce que le problème, la limite, c'est là, c'est les mémoires, mais pas que somatique, il est beaucoup plus que ça. Mais justement, maintenant, dans les nouvelles formes qui sont en train d'explorer l'intelligence artificielle, comme le nouveau projet, c'est une sorte d'une intelligence artificielle du monde, justement. Est-ce que celle-là pourrait justement venir à résoudre ce problème de cette mémoire, de cette absence de mémoire?
So definitely, it's a great point that I mentioned. The lack of embodiment is basically, we keep forgetting, that this is a very, very limited, like agent, right? When I worked with the computer scientists in my project, so the computer scientists that I worked with, they developed supervised AI. So basically, these were early systems where you had to train the system, you had to give feedback to the system each time it gave an output. Okay, whereas today's systems, they basically learn, by themselves through analysis of patterns of big data. But what I found, these computer scientists, what they did, they first simplified the problem that their systems had to solve. For example, so I studied two research groups in the United States. One group basically focused on developing a jazz improviser, an artificial jazz improviser that was basically a software program, okay? And the music was generated by, like the sound that comes from the computer. Whereas the second group tried to also develop a robot musician that played the music that was generated on a vibraphone. And that's already like going into the world, right? That's trying to develop a fully embodied artificial musician, which is a much more complicated problem. But the first group, the PI told me, yes, I simplified the problem by not trying to develop a fully embodied musician. And then in subsequent conversations, he told me that the fact that his system was able to improvise shows that creativity is very simple. That human creativity is not something complicated. So what I saw is that first he simplified the problem, the search space that the system had to tackle. And then he kind of erased the fact that he simplified the problem. And he came to the conclusion that human creativity is simple. But in fact, human creativity was simple for him because he simplified the problem that human creativity had to solve. Whereas the second group, because he tried to develop a fully embodied artificial musician, they told me, the PI there told me human creativity is so much more complicated that there's no way for us at the moment to actually create it. And we see today, like for example, with autonomous vehicles, we have been promised, autonomous cars, etc., that they will be everywhere, and they are making progress. But that's actually in a way, it's a simplified search space. It's relatively speaking, it's a search space with a limited number of variables that the systems need to deal with, but it's still very complicated. So to create an artificially embodied agent that can actually operate in the world is a very, very complicated thing. So you're right. The problem of memory is also in part the fact that we don't have the embodied, that the agents do not have the embodied dimensions of what we would call memoir. But more specifically, OpenAI does not retain like the connection between interactions, between the interactions that you had, like for example, with the system 10 days ago and the interaction that you are having today. So in that respect, there is no intertextuality in the very simple, not so simple, but in the very specific sense that Silverstein explained. But of course, there is a kind of intertextuality here because the interactions that we are having with the agents are disassembled and then aggregated, etc. So there is something that is informing all these interactions. There is a kind of intertextuality, but of a very, very, very different kind. And this is why these agents provide like new opportunities to complexify these analytical concepts that we have of signification, circulation, and emanation.
Thanks a lot. I would like to very briefly relate to an experience I had, but especially a colleague of ours had reported here in the seminar, and then ask you a more general question. We especially do tests with images, with styles, and we try to make images do something strange. That is, for instance, one test was to ask to Midjourney and other multimodal generative models to picture a photos of a couple or photos taken by two different actants. We were inspired by the production of Denis Roche, who did La photo en forme de nu, that is photos of overlapping of bodies or of shadows and so on. So strange, and we realized that the model was increasing its capacity every day, every time we tasted it.
Capacity to do what?
The capacity to understand our question, our prompt, and it was the first time. It was very banal. I don't know, two people represented, and then he began really to do something very, very complex in the sense of the doubleness of some, and so on. So we really tested. We have the proofs that this capacity increased and that it was possible to educate with. So this is only a report. You tell me what you think about the. I don't know if images work in a different way, in the sense that the noising and denoising systems are different than the large language models.
But just also understand, like you taught the system to do what?
To do, for instance, photos.
To replicate, which is the opposite probably of what his prompt was.
Yes, different, sure. So, to do something paradoxical, inspired by the arts, because it exists in Denis Roche production and so on. But other examples has been done. For instance, to reproduce a video with the rhythm of the voices of a Godard film.
To imitate.
And so to imitate, yes.
The opposite of.
Yeah, but I wonder, like, how is that related to actual to this? This is what I'm trying to understand. Like, where
the fact about memory, the fact that there is a memory and a possibility in the interaction of stabilize a let's say register of asking, a register of paradoxical questions. It was only this.
Mhm.
The second observation. It's interesting, I think, what you propose about arts and science, the both, but neither. And I worked a lot on scientific iconography and scientific discourse, and I think that what I see in these answers and this way of discussing you and ChatGPT, I see the register or regime in French of dissemination, popularization of science. I think that it's not science, no, it's not art, but it's really this hybrid that we can study. It's very complex because it can seem stupid or banal, but it's very complex because you take some non-revealed parts and other components that are, in a sense, more global than in scientific reports. Because in scientific reports you don't take the large frame. You often put your attention on the detailed frame. So this was a proposition, and then the first question and the third commentary is about something it's not really the focus of your speech, but it's about circulation of the type from tokens. So I wanted to ask you something more general, as we did with Aurora, about sedimentation and innovation. How could you describe this this is circulation of type. We know the textualized theory of the fact that something emerged from the interaction, the occurrences, the tokens of interactions. But how could you explain more in detail the trajectory from a number of tokens and the fixation, if we on a type that is able to circulate? It's always a problem of mereology, bricolage. I don't know what he asked to Aurora. Thanks.
Well, with respect to the third question, no, I can't, because as I explained, I think that the actual stabilization, the process itself, is opaque. Yeah, I could not tell you.
Not in general, not on ChatGPT in general. It's a very general question.
In general, but that of course depends on the specific ethnographic context of typification. So I wouldn't be able to say something in general about how it happens. With respect to the second question about the arts and sciences and the fact that it doesn't, the bots do not embody any of these agencies. Perhaps I'll do like the kind of self-presentation, because Juan's presentation of myself was very short. I will do the work for him for a little bit, just because it serves like the answer. So I said in the middle of the lecture that I have always been interested in sites, institutional sites, where precisely this division between these two kinds of agencies is blurred. And you mentioned the first book that I wrote, which was about academic programs for jazz music in the United States. Basically, the institutionalization of jazz socialization in academy. Today, jazz musicians, if they want to learn how to improvise, they go to these pedagogical sites. And the academically trained jazz musician is precisely kind of like a hybrid. On the one hand, it's an artist. The other hand, it's an artist that was trained in rational methods. And I was interested in the kind of like identity work and also the contradictions that emerge when you have this kind of hybridity. And then I worked with innovation consultants, basically in Silicon Valley, basically business consultants they claim that they can teach companies how to be creative. So basically how to be innovative, how to generate new products and services. And there too, I was interested in how this rational basis, they have all kinds of rational routines for helping companies think outside of the box. So here too, we have kind of this combination of creativity and rationality. So that was like the second project, second book. And then I went to this field, which again, these are early technological systems prior to generative AI that we know today. So supervised artificial intelligence, and specifically systems that produce poetry and improvised jazz. And I was interested, again, in this kind of like hybridity between a scientific attempt, or not between, but a scientific attempt to generate art in a very kind of algorithmic way. So the reason that I'm saying this is just to note that this disruption of the division of labor between these two generative agencies that we see at ChatGPT, it's not like the first time that we see such a disruption. There are other institutional sites where these two agencies kind of like coexist, not in a pure way, but you know that they impact one another and they mingle and they change one another. But ChatGPT is just like a very prominent kind of like institutional site at the moment where this thing is happening. Yeah, that's.
Il y a une question en ligne de Emiliano.
Allora,
yeah.
Emiliano, Alumine, Enzo, Anna.
Okay. I go first, right? Yeah. Thank you, Eitan, for your exciting presentation. I have to say that last year I wrote the inspiration. I read the Inspiration Machine, and I find it so inspiring to the writing process of my thesis. So thank you for that. And the question is, if you had the possibility to interact with text-to-music models, and in that case, if you think that it's possible to compare some kind of agentive dimensions or even agentive features between ChatGPT and certain platforms with that kind of models.
So thank you for the question. So you're asking if I had the opportunity to interact with music generators that are based on the same architecture as ChatGPT?
Yeah, with generative models from text to music. For example, like Suno, like Udio, that kind of platforms based on generative models to automatic composition.
Okay. So no, I did not do anything serious with these artificial models. But I have to say that even when I improvise, so during my research, I actually musically improvised with the simple systems that were the basis of my research. And even then, although like the music itself, yeah, I would not consider it to be equal to anything that a jazz musician, a competent, even an incompetent, might produce. It's very easy to get sucked into the kind of like the illusion that you are improvising together with with an agent. And in the same way that we have we see the temptation to believe, to hold the same belief with textual generative agencies. So I can imagine that, contemporary technologies are much more advanced, and they would be even kind of like more convincing. But of course, again, the embodied dimension, anyone who has improvised in real time knows that the embodied dimension is crucial for jazz improvisation, but as we know, also like for human interaction that is centered on language. So I can imagine that the experience, while it might be convincing on some levels, it might be very, very lacking in other respects. And we might find the same kind of problems where what I called like the agent losing the plot of the interaction. I can see how that can happen in a jazz improvisation, where the agent, artificial agent, loses the plot of the emergent construction that has been built up to that specific moment of the improvisation, and loses the plot in a way.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I couldn't read the Inspiration Machine, but I really want to, because I was thinking, I wanted to come back, if you can come back to the example of Pollock and the idea of a romantic artist or something like that, because I think that in Hollywood cinema, but it's always the same stereotype of artist, and it's always a rational one and the inspiring one. Chrysler's versus Pollock, Picasso versus Matisse. I remember Modigliani versus Picasso, and so on. And it's always like that. And I'm quite curious because in some papers or books I read, it's not a lot, but it's very easy to talk about creativity or artisticité. And I think that it's quite complex to say that something created by a machine is art, because we know that the art circuit or institution is more complex than that and need human actors, curators, art historians, museums directors, and so on. So I'm quite curious about that, because I would love to read your book, because I think that there is a third element that makes the difference, that is inspiration, because it's in the middle, and it's the tension between creativity and art, because the inspiration have a kind of trauma. Like, and when the artist, I'm thinking about Pollock, for instance. It's like the film also shows the moment he tried, and it's very rational. That's a very rational process. And it's like the data, no, the input that he put to find this moment when he started performing this painting. So I wanted to come back to the example and your proposal about the romantic definition of artists and the relationship with AI.
What is actually the question?
This, how do you link it? Because I didn't get it. Like how it's working, the romantic idea. I think.
Yeah. Okay, I see.
What's the place of inspiration in this relationship, if you consider that?
Okay. So the inspiration itself was not so much like an issue in this analysis, but the very opaqueness, the fact that there is a process here that by technological definition is opaque in generative AI. It's opaque for the developers themselves because of the very technological, the computational models. And we have the same kind of opaqueness as we saw like in the quote by Kant. He basically says that Homer could not tell you how he arrived, at his epos. Why? Because it's an opaque process. Even he himself does not know how he created like his. And for Kant, that's a definition of inspired art. So the opaqueness. This is why I gave like the history, kind of like a very short history, from ancient Greece. The opaqueness was based on the fact that the content came from outside. What is inspiration? Literally, it's a supernatural kind of like entity that breathes, right? That's the idea of inspiration. It's like some kind of like verb, the content into the artist, and the artist is just a vessel. So yeah, the opaqueness is the kind of element that harkens back to this romantic notion. On the other hand, we have like this chatty feature of all these technologies. You can ask them how did you arrive to what you arrived, and then it can give you like a verbal diarrhea of explanations, right? That presumably point to the certain, to the steps, the 20,000 steps that we took. But no, it's not really. This is not how it happened. The opacity remains in the very in the process. So you have like these two kind of things that for many users, ChatGPT is considered as a kind of like scientific authority, because it's connected to all these data sources, but because it's connected to Silicon Valley as a kind of prestigious, scientific wizardry. But at the same time, it's very opaque. They treat it as a kind of like an oracle that they can approach any minute, and whose inner workings they have no clue about.
Enzo, une question?
Yeah, can I ask the question in French? It's easier for me.
You can try.
Okay, I will try in English. So thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. I would like to ask you if there is maybe another paradox or another ambiguity to add to the one you talked about between subjectivity and institutional, because it seems to me that another innovation or another feature of ChatGPT is the fact that she or he can talk like a singular subject, but it also mobilizes some alignment with institutional register. For instance, in your example, you asked about the memory of ChatGPT, and she or he or it says that he cannot register, he cannot take into account the singular conversation. And it seems to me that in this answer, there is some idea of privacy, to respect privacy, so some kind of institutional rules that she or he has to respect. So there is this double, this ambiguity between singular enunciation and institutional enunciation or alignment. And I try to do some tests because I work on games on ludic attitude, that it seems to me that there is something similar with improvisation, etc. And so when I try to pretend play with ChatGPT, I found out the same result you've spoken about. So the idea that she can say that she will use a role. For instance, we can play doctor and patients, but in reality, there is not interaction because she tends to play in a serious manner, and also she builds narration and not interaction. She builds texts, and so there is not a real interaction between the two. And so my idea is, my question is, maybe we can try to test the creativity or the identity work, something you mentioned, with ChatGPT or this kind of model by try to play, because we know there is no body, there is not organic body, but we can play with language in a way. And at the moment, it seems to me that this model cannot play because they cannot play a role or an identity in a personal way or in a complex way. And so another question is linked to this concept of emanation. And my question is, is there different kind of scale in emanation? Because you talked about Kant, then you talked about some institution like school, and then ChatGPT. So we can articulate different scale of sites of emanation.
Thank you for these questions. Again, I'll start from the last just because I remember it.
Okay.
So I don't know that there is a scale here, but you're absolutely right that we need to explain what makes something, how something becomes a site of emanation. And here it's related to historical processes and also lines of influence, what has influence and what's not. And there is like also the scope of dissemination and the usage. So I wouldn't define it as a skill, but as the result of contingent historical processes that make something widely disseminated and widely listened to, widely adhered to. It's kind of like when we talk about why certain artists have become canonized. So of course the simple explanation, the uncritical, is because they are great artists, right? But the more sociological, anthropological analysis is actually to show the historically contingent processes by means of which certain artists became canonized. So we need to talk about auctions, we need to talk about certain gallery owners, we need to talk about habitus of certain artists, we need to talk about all kinds of ways. So it's not so much like the skill as these very complex historical processes, which in the case of ChatGPT, this is why I said in large part, or in part, it's the combination of these two agencies. But of course, that's just one part of the story. There is like the power of Silicon Valley. There is all kinds of ideological forces at work. There is the fact that it emanated from the West. There's like the techno-ideological kind of like paradigm that everything that is engineered and algorithmicized is better, etc., etc. With respect to that, to this tension between subjectivity and institutionalization, you mentioned briefly this context of doctors and patients, and I think that that's a good example because doctors, I feel, also many times combine this subjective and institutional. They very often speak, as of course individuals, but they speak through the voice of an institution because they are abiding by clinical algorithms. This is how they call it actually. Clinical algorithms of how to do or how to react to different situations. And when you actually try to engage with them as individuals, you see that it's not always simple. They speak through the clinical algorithms. So you have the same kind of tension where you are facing a subjectivity, but it's actually a subjectivity that is totally animated by a very specific institution with its own ways of doing things in situations where it matters the most for yourself as a patient. And it can be very frustrating.
Thank you.
Non, c'est 5 heures déjà.
Malheureusement, oui. On a Anne, Aurora ou Mila. Désolée.
3 questions courtes, les réponses aussi. Anne?
Oui, ma question est très courte. Est-ce que vous avez pu éclaircir avec vos parents leur réaction à travers le filtre de ChatGPT?
Still impossible d'éclaircir avec ma maman.
On a la même question.
Vous avez
Avec une boîte de main.
impossible, c'est ça la réponse.
Oui.
Impossible.
Vous êtes allé un peu plus loin quand même. Vous êtes allé un peu plus loin, armé des ChatGPT, vous avez recommencé.
Parce qu'il y a une valeur scientifique. Mais avec ma maman, il n'y a pas de valeur à continuer de discuter ce sujet.
Elle vous dit ce qu'elle aurait préféré.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle a préféré?
Oui. Comment elle aurait voulu que soit rédigée cette dédicace?
No, I showed. She would have liked me to say mes parents.
Oui, c'est ça. Et elle était offensée de ça. Ce n'était pas bien.
Oui.
Donc, qu'aurait-elle voulu? Elle a pu vous l'exprimer, ce qui aurait été correct, ce qui aurait été recevable.
Can you translate because I don't know so
No. I think that
Elle a dit à mes
Non, tu aurais dû écrire à mes parents.
that was a dedication. In Gilead, and she was pissed because I didn't say it to my parents.
Elle voulait que vous disiez à mes parents et vous avez dit
Voilà.
c'est pas suffisant.
Voilà.
C'est une question de statut alors.
So did Gilead have a reaction?
To me?
Did Gilead have a reaction?
Well, when he sees that she has a reaction, he just backs off.
Justement, est-ce que c'est pas. Moi, je pensais que vous aviez fait exprès de mettre cet en tête, parce que je trouve que ça résonne avec le problème que vous posez. Quelle est la source de génératrice, hein? Parce que quand on dit papa et maman, déjà, on renvoie à une source et qui elle-même renvoie à une ancestralité. Donc, en tout cas, cette réponse-là n'est pas fournie par GPT, mais en même temps, on voit que GPT fournit quelque chose en fonction de la source que vous êtes en faisant le prompt. C'est une remarque.
I missed some of this.
no, that it's that ChatGPT did not report the possible interpretation of the problem of ancestrality.
Well, I'm not sure. Par exemple, peut-être un mal d'interprétation, he's talking here. He talks here about the relation familiale. Anyway, yeah.
Aurora?
Yeah, my parents, I dedicated my second book to my parents and and I used the same format of dedication that you used, and they were
Just me.
like, yeah, and they, I mean, they would have hated if I had used to my parents. They would have, you know, yeah, they would say, are you our daughter or what? So anyways, this is for a different, but we can chat about it later. But my question has to do with something, I mean, I follow this podcast from the New York Times, the Hard Fork podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yes, yes. So they were having this episode which had to do with why large language models are not very good at creative writing. And they were interviewing this, I don't know, this specialist or this, I mean, she's more of a Jasmine Spoon, I think it's her name. And she said that she tried different prompts. And it turns out that it seems that ChatGPT is worse than previous chatbots like GPT-2 or GPT-3, which seem to be more creative than ChatGPT because, according to her, there's post-training, and the post-training makes them, you know, very standardized, which somehow resembles a little bit, I mean, or resonates with what Maria Giulia was saying about the prompt that she was giving to the Midjourney, in the sense that they got trained and they would then become more capable of doing the parody or the stereotype of the picture or the photograph that you were trying to. So it was this post-training factor that created, you know, that somehow that created this kind of more average or more yeah. So I'm interested here, I mean, because it all resonates with creativity and innovation, sedimentation. So I'm trying, and also in relationship, I mean, it's more of a comment than a question, but I ultimately want to hear what you think about that, because then we started off with signification, circulation, and emanation, right? And the fact, you know, we all know that Silverstein didn't really take too much into account change. So it was more.
Well, I mean, the lexical creativity introduced change.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that was the idea, that you can change the contextual surround by introducing something and then solidifying it in real time.
But it's not creation or it's not innovation, right? It's more like the production of a new indexical link that restructures, you know, the
That's kind of creativity. Anyway, I mean,
because another element is the fact that we're talking about Pollock versus, I don't know, or Matisse versus Picasso. So also ideologies of creativity, which is another layer that is a little bit different from the stuff that you were saying, but it's still related. And I was also thinking about how somehow sometimes an artist becomes a prisoner of his or her own style that sets a precedent, and then you cannot really break free from the expectation. So, which is another, but it's similar to the automation that is generated. So, I don't know exactly where I want to get at, but yeah, I think that ultimately it's a question of creating a class of executions that fit within that class, or create a type token relation that somehow are two different operations in a way. And so I don't know if you can, you know, react to this inputs without actually answering a question, because I don't have a real question. But
no, the question of style is of course very interesting. Style itself is based on a very specific ideology, and of course it's stereotypification. It's based on that. But yeah, artists, you know, for them, for many artists, the style, once they develop a style, it becomes recognizable. They have no
escape.
No, I tell you, they have no escape. They have no, for many artists, if the style is recognizable and successful, they have no desire to break away from that style. because precisely people expect them to continue in that style. But the interesting thing about these innovation consultants that I worked with is that they actually, their problem, like they claim that this is precisely what they offer to companies, because the problem of companies, of course, is that they develop something successful and then they get trapped into just because when something is successful, you just want to continue to reproduce it because it makes money. But of course, until the moment when there is a disruptor, like a competitor, and basically and then you discover too late that the market has been colonized by this competitor, and then you're done. So their actually challenge is to continue to innovate, even though they already have successful products, and it's very counterintuitive for them to actually do that, because you want to continue to just specialize in what you do good and what sells well. I should say that this chapter, since we were talking about Silverstein, is going to be published in a book that is the combination of 3 conferences that were organized in his honor. So yeah, if someone wants to be more acquainted with kind of like an overview of how his many students continue to develop his ideas, then that book might be a good way to do it.
University Press,
Yes.
by the way.
Yeah.
Urmila.
So thanks, Eitan, for that very interesting talk. I would have to read it to really get into it and really understand the various arguments that you make. But talking about ChatGPT as a site of value production, and particularly as a site that increasingly replaces the human production of economic value. And as a former translator, shall we say, I've been trying to wrap my head around how we might use the notion of intertextuality and interdiscursivity, as Michael Silverstein talks about it, to think about what's going on here and to differentiate what ChatGPT does from what human beings do. So for Silverstein, intertextuality and interdiscursivity, the fundamental unit of it is the indexical icon, right? And you recognize the indexical icon on the one hand because of your personal biography. You can trace out the chains, the interdiscursive, intertextual chains going back to some baptismal moment when you first encountered a word. That's one way in which intertextuality works. But you also simultaneously have to suppose that there is something like language that is collectively shared, and that's the other dimension of it. So that's sort of how he theorizes it in case of human beings. And I've been trying to think about how that would apply in case of ChatGPT and what it does, given this opacity and the black box nature of how it works. And I was wondering if maybe, I mean, this is just, I'm just wondering aloud, literally. As you mentioned, ChatGPT works based on curated data sets, vast corpora. And I was wondering if maybe these modes of curation are one way in which the indexical icons come to be shaped within these data sets. And yeah, I don't know if, in case of human beings, you have other theorists, like within the Boasian tradition, you have Wolf, for example, who posits a human unconscious within which language exists. And so that becomes the sort of substratum, is the word that you use in one of your articles, in which language and culture are presumed to exist, to put here. And maybe the corpus, these giant corpora, are like substrata in which these indexical icons and these, language and culture come to subsist somehow for ChatGPT. I don't know. I'm just wondering how we can compare intertextuality and interdiscursivity, say, human beings versus what's going on here,
I think that the aggregation kind of like an obvious way of, because you mentioned it, how it's aggregated, and that's also related to what you asked earlier. How many steps, I don't remember how you phrased it, how many steps it takes for something to become like typified, right? So I think it's like in all these ways that you mentioned. But the interesting thing again, and that this is why, did you disconnect my PowerPoint?
I think so.
Okay. Because
I did not discuss.
yeah, it's fine. Because I wanted to show again like the translation from what he argues, so saying that we do not communicate as asocial and disembodied agents with everyone at the same time. And what I argued is this is precisely what ChatGPT does. You know, it's a disembodied, asocial agent that communicates with everyone at the same time about everything. And in that respect, there is like a baptismal event for each human user, you know, who interacts with ChatGPT. But as opposed to like these personal baptismal events that, humans can go back to, you know, which is kind of like a private event. Here it's kind of like a semi-private public event because it happens simultaneously in a way, not simultaneously, but it happens across these semiotic nodes that are the interactions between humans and ChatGPT. And in that respect, there is something very interesting, which is like the baptismal event of something that is very standardized. You know, it's we have like these private interactions with this bot, but these actually very public interactions. Not only in the sense that the data is aggregated, but the input that we receive is based on all these this massive number of interactions that everyone is having with the bot.
But is there a baptismal event for ChatGPT? I mean,
well, that returns to the aggregation. Yeah, to the aggregation, the solidification of certain, let's say, that returns like to that very long explanation that ChatGPT provided about how it arrives to conclusions. So basically, what it describes there is a kind of like form of solidification of conclusions. I'm using solidification really like it comes from this nebulous, you know, kind of like data, and suddenly, not suddenly, but through these steps, a certain point becomes like a typified, it becomes like a baptismal event in a way. This is what I would.
Yes, so we have to stop about that. Oui, mais Alumine peut demander peut-être aussi tu viens déjeuner.
No. En fait, c'était, sorry, it was about the question Aurora asked, because it's linked to mine, that the problem with artisticity, that it's linked to human actors, because the style, the artists have to change or not the style, because the market asks for that. And this is very important to divide between creativity and art. I mean, Picasso was all the time changing the style and was bad view at some point, or good view. For instance, the year 1932 is known because was the moment that the art critics said that Picasso was dead, and he had to change, and he became part of the surrealism. So, and in the case of the film, to come back to the film, Modigliani is represented as the opposite of the rational Picasso, that it's all the time calculating what to do because of the art critic asks for that. And Modigliani still stays in his own style, and he has not success. I mean, so it's all the time. That's why I was asking about the difference, because the human actors, finally, the art institution is very complex, and the machine had not that problem. It just creates, it's a result.
That pressure doesn't have the pressure that the artist has.
Yeah, it's just the result of a problem. I mean,
But the machine itself, of course, the technology is under pressure. It's under pressure from OpenAI and the companies.
Yeah.
There is a market there also that has its own demands, like does the machine produce obscenities, for example? Then you need to change it. So, yeah. But you're right. It's a good.
Like there are contemporary artists that are using AI, so it's like both.
And they create it.
That even, yeah, that it's even more interesting. Yeah, that creates like more complications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bravissimi.
On se revoit la semaine prochaine
Oui.
avec
Avec François Provenzano, Semir Badir et Stéphane Polis, le trio de Liège. Vous ne pouvez pas manquer ce rendez-vous. Ciao, ciao, bonne soirée tout le monde.